Welcome to video 104. I've been receiving a few emails in a very short space of time asking questions about GPS. So this is part one, hopefully, of a multi-part series of videos around doing something with the GPS data. Now, in most cases, the GPS units have a software tool attached to them, so you may well be able to do some quite reasonable analysis inside the software. But my experiences are that you most likely want to export it out so that you can combine it with some other data streams. So I'm going to assume that you have exported out your data and created a data table that has information about multiple sessions over time. So let's go and look at that database sheet. I just used a random number generator, so the information's a little bit generic, but nevertheless, what is important to note here is the principles of setting up your data table. Talked about this at length in video number 88, and I talked about the fact that you want to have as many descriptors as possible before you look at your data. So in this case, we've got some really obvious descriptors here. I'll just shade them slightly different. Now, these descriptors allow us to do analysis based upon player, position type, session type, day of the week, date, and to some extent we could use attendance as a way to exclude all sessions that weren't full sessions. For example, if you had an athlete miss some sessions because of injury, you might want to exclude them from the analysis. Anyway, those descriptors are really important. I've used an Excel table format, and you can see columns G across to the right are all our data fields that we can now do some work with. Just one thing before we move on, and that is on the design tab is where you can see that this table is called TBL GPS. So I always use TBL as my prefix for a table name, and it makes it just easy to write formulas. If you've seen some of my videos before, you would have heard me say that over and over. What I really wanted to talk about was how, now that you've got your data in a table, what are you going to do with it? Now, the first report, and the one that I want to cover in this session, is just a basic session report. So there's really only one critical filter that you need to extract information, and that is a date field. So I've put that in gold up the top here. Haven't taken a lot of care to format this sheet yet. We can take care of that as the tutorial goes on, but at the moment what we have is a blank cell that I can type a date into. Now, if there is some data for that date, it'll find that data and pull it in with the current formula. I'm going to start this again in just a second, but for now I'm just going to show you that if I change the date on this, for example, to the 4th, that the data updates. What I've also done is create drop-down boxes for these column headings so that you can play around with which variables are providing you with the most interesting report, and it may not always be the same. So the ability to, in a match circumstance, look at certain variables, whereas in a training circumstance you might want to look at other ones. So for example, velocity zone 2 distance is very unlikely to be interesting, so you might decide that you want that to be accelerations, and that should just come through the way that we've set our table up. Above this line here, I've got team and position averages, and that's going to be very useful for us in this tutorial, because what I wanted to do is show you that you could express the session data in a number of ways. This drop-down box is toggling between those options. The first one is that you just actually pull out the data. How far did they run? How many accelerations? What velocity zone 6 distance did they do? So that's the easiest way, and that's probably the way to start with. That's going to be what most people are expecting to see. But in my opinion, when you get GPS data, the real value comes in referencing that against something else. You might reference it against a target for that session. You might reference it against game loads or game distances. You might reference it against other things such as a position or team average. So this drop-down box allows you to choose which one of those references you might like. And if I, for example, reference it against the team, then all of these players will be referencing each of those variables against the team average. So anyone significantly below or above the team average might be someone that you put some extra scrutiny on to see if they're either needing some extra recovery or some extra conditioning depending on your preferences. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. I've done this in a very simple way so that it's easy to understand. I would most likely do this in a lot of this work in another sheet, like a workings tab, and pull it into our dashboard report sheet. But by doing it here, it makes it a little bit easier to follow. All right, let's get started on constructing this table. There's no links here. I could reference these names to the control panel. Here you can see the names. I haven't done that just for simplicity's sake, but it would be a good idea that you did something like this. Instead of typing or pasting in the name, you could click on here and click on here. That way, if there was a additional player added or a player removed, then this report would update. Certainly not a bad way to go. Here we've got a drop down box in already, so I'm just going to remove those settings so that we can start again. On the control panel page, what I've set up is a variable table. Now these variables are the ones that we have collected and that you want to allow your users to select from when they're creating the session report. So we've got it in a table. We could reference the column in the table, but that can be a bit tricky if you're not used to doing that. So I'm going to select all of these values, and in the name box I'm going to give it a regular name. So I'm going to call it list GPS var. So GPS variables is what I have referred to that as. Now back on the session report, I can select those gold cells. On the data tab, choose data validation, choose list, and I can either type it in, or if I'm on a PC I can hit F3 and I can pick from a list. So list of GPS variables pops up, and so we're now making some progress. We can choose what we like. Let's get something populated in here because it will help us moving forward. That'll do. Alright, next thing we want to do is pull in what position these athletes are. So quick check on our control panel page. We can see we've got a table called player details and the position is next to it. So I've written the table name there, so it should be easy for us to do that reference. So VLOOKUP is probably the easiest formula to extract that with. You could do it with index and match, but let's use VLOOKUP. We want to look up Andy Johnson. Where do we want to look it up? And if I start typing TBL, you can see all my list of tables appears, and that's why I do it this way, because it makes it pretty easy even if you've forgotten the name of your table. Next we want to say what column number our position is in, and an exact or an approximate lookup. So I rushed through that. If you haven't done VLOOKUP, go and check it out. There's plenty of good videos about it on YouTube, and you won't have to look too hard to get that. Now, when we come to drawing a chart later, having a full name when you've got this many players is often a little bit annoying. So I'm just going to type Andy. Nothing's happened yet, but if I type Byron, hopefully Flash Fill will guess that we want to put first name only in, and I can just hit enter and it's all been completed for me. We have got two mics here, so I might go down and say something like this. Just to clarify that one. Now it's time to put the team and position averages in. Now there's a critical caveat here, and the way that I'm doing this calculation now works only if there's a single session every day. If there's multiple sessions every day, then putting a date in isn't going to help. We'll need to have a list of sessions. So if there was double session days, you might have a customized little unique identifier that says something like the 4th of the 2nd 2017 morning, or 10 a.m. or session 1. So there's a few ways you could do it, but you'd need to distinguish between 2 sessions in a day somehow. This is on the assumption that there is only 1 session. Before we start extracting out information for the team, positions and individual, the trick of having customizable column headings requires us to use a dynamic index function. Now that is something that you might not have seen before, but what it does is it allows the formula to decide which column the data is in. So we've got duration, and if we go to the control panel page quickly, we can see that duration is column 7 of our data table. I just put them in there with a function on its own. I'll use the index function. I used VLOOKUP before. I could do that again, but it's all about learning as much about Excel as possible, and that just comes from practice. So we want to look in the variable table. We want to pull out the column number, and we want to do that based upon matching whatever's here with whatever is in the first column of the table. So that's sorted, and we can see that it updates if we choose something else. So this is going to be a very helpful little tool for us. Let's put distance down, something like that. Alright, so if I copy this across now, the problem that we have is that table references update, and there's a couple of ways to stop that from happening, but in the efforts of keeping it nice and clean, I'm going to simply paste it in. And if we choose something like max velocity, we can see that it has stayed true to the formula that we intended. So it's looking in the column and it's matching whatever's in F7. So we can move on now. Let's start extracting out some of our, firstly, team average and position average scores. Now these are relatively easy formulas to write, but there is one trick. If you want to reference a table dynamically, then you need to either have a complex formula, or you can use a trick where you use this column identifier, which says 8 at the moment, to tell us which column of the table to look in. So let's have a crack at this. We've got a single criteria average that we're looking to do. What is the average of the team on a particular date? So date is our criteria. Let's put that in first. So using date as our criteria, our date is in B4, we need to lock that down. This is the bit that's tricky. We can use index to reference the entire GPS data table. So I'm not going to specify a column here. I'm simply going to put a comma. We want all rows, so I put another comma, and I reference this value here to tell us that that's the column we're looking in. So if I hit enter now, that is coming through and it looks pretty good, and if I change it, it looks to be updating. So whether that's right or not, we'll have to do some testing later, but it looks on face value to be correct. Now if I copy this across, we should fill in those other 4, and it doesn't look like we need to do any editing on that. So let's just check it, click inside the formula bar, and we can see that it is looking at the right thing. So now we need a double criteria average. So it's a little bit harder, but not much. It's the same process. This one is average ifs. What is our average range? Note that we have to do it first this time. When you do more than one criteria, it asks you for the average range first. So we have to do the same thing as we did before. So that's our index range. Now we just put our criteria in and we're good to go. So first criteria is date. Second criteria is position, and the position is identified here. I can't quite see it, so I'm just going to use my arrow key to complete the formula. Now if I hit enter, bit of an error because I deleted those things out. Alright, that was easy, and let's try and see what happens if I paste those across. Yep, that looks like it's working great. So we've done our averages. I'll put this line back in just for formatting purposes. Now we're into option 1. How are we going to do this? Option 1 is to extract the data without any conversions. There's 2 ways to do this, and I've done it very simply here to explain the process. A double column lookup will work. We need to find all instances where this athlete on this date has a value. There's a video link here on the right hand side. It's from the Excel master himself, Mike Gervin, and it's about 6 or 7 years old now, this video, but it explains very carefully how to do that double column lookup. Don't want to delay this video by getting into that, and I wouldn't recommend this method anyway, simply because it's an array formula, and that means that it is pretty thirsty on your computer. So if you ever have your computer slowing down, it could be because you've got some of these bad boys in there. Alright, so a far better way, if you only have 1 session per day, is to do a basic sum if. Now I'd typically just put that in here, but what I'm trying to demonstrate is that if we want to have this fancy method of being able to choose your expression type, then we want some workings tables so that this final formula to populate the main report table is easy. So if you bear with me, I'm going to come across to the side here. And I've duplicated the table in a much more compact way here. So let's look at this formula. It basically says the same as we've looked at before, uses our special index method, and it does a sum if of player name on a particular player date. So we just looked at average if before. Sum if works the same way. If you haven't done sum ifs before, have a little look on YouTube for it. It's a dead easy formula, and with a familiar data set you'll be able to learn it really quickly. Now the next one is where it starts getting interesting. If we scroll down, I've got position reference. Now to make it easy, certainly easy to follow, I've put in a lookup function that pulls in their position. Now we just did this a few minutes ago, so hopefully it looks familiar. On the basis of our lookup table on the control panel sheet, what position is Andy, Byron, Calvin, Chris, etc. And then once I've done that, I simply populate the appropriate position average into the table. And those position averages have come from here. We just calculated them a couple of minutes ago. And now if we scroll down a little bit further, we have got the same thing for team reference. It's the same value for everyone in the team, so I didn't need to list everyone out. What is our team reference for those things? So team reference just means what was the average of the team for the session that we have selected. The next point that I want to show is sometimes I've done projects for people where they have been looking to have a comparison against a preconceived target. So across a week they'll have sessions that are considered technical sessions, so therefore with very low GPS outputs, and there are sessions that are considered stimulus sessions or power sessions is one of the terms I've used before, where you're trying to get a physical response, and therefore there's quite high metrics come out of it. So let's go to the control panel page. I just made these numbers up, so don't read anything into them. That we've got a mixed session, a technical session, and a power session. And these are the typical metrics that a coach would be aiming for when they were running one of these sessions. sports that I've done this with people in include rugby and football, so it is used a little bit out there, but I'm sure the concept is probably more valuable than the actual numbers. So these are the reference points. If we do a technical session, this is kind of what we're used to having. Relatively slow, quite long duration, and not too much velocity and things like that. So here's a table, it's called TBL sessions, and if we go to our database, we can see that we've got a session type. Now the only session type that's not in that table is game. So if you pick a game day, it's not going to populate that particular reference. So let's choose the 3rd of the session. So let's choose the 7th of the 2nd in our session report and get to work on figuring out how this goes. So this is a power session. Power session means a physical type session, and we can see that on the basis of power here that all players have targets of what you see, certain number of sprint efforts and max velocity and so on. And finally, I've got some game data here. Now I've just included all rows because I just manufactured this data set. My suspicion is you'd probably want to identify key matches to include in this and to custom build this game data table. So what is a standard game data output for Chris Jackson? You might have 20, 30, 40, 50 games worth of data on this person, but there might be a dozen matches that you've used as your reference point. So it's up to you, but what I've done is simply do an average of all game data in the data set. So this is a dynamic table, which means that every time you add more game data to this main data set, those averages are going to update and stay live. So over time they may have less sharpness to them, especially if your data covers multiple seasons, but you get the point. I'm sure you can figure it out. And so now all that's happened here is that we've got those game averages being sucked into this little workings table here. And as you can see, I didn't take a lot of care in creating interesting data sets. I just did some random calculations. So these all look pretty similar, and normally they wouldn't be as generic. But what we now have is we've got 5 little sets of data in columns W to AB. And we can now do something pretty interesting, which is pull into our main report any of those numbers referenced against each other. So a function that you may not have done much of is the choose function. Choose means that based upon an index number, it'll produce some reference for you. So I'll explain that far better by a demonstration. These are our 5 options. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And depending on which one I choose, you can see this number here updates. This is a very simple match function. So if I choose game reference, it's option number 5. If I choose a basic extraction, it's option number 1. And so what might our choose function look like? I'm going to do it over here firstly, and then I'm going to paste it in. Now let's see what the formula wants us to do. So what is our index number? So that's the first thing. This is our index number up here. We were just talking about it a second ago. Make sure you lock it with F4. If they just choose a basic extract, then that's the only number we have to pull out. If they choose option 2, what do we do? Well, option 2 is a reference of the extracted data against a position average. So that would look like this. This number divided by this number. Now we want to leave them all open at the moment, so no dollar signs, because when we copy this around, we want it to go down the table and across the table. Value number 3, what if we choose third option, which is referencing against the team average? Once again, we click on X25 because that's our primary value, and then we reference against the team. We have to lock this one by row, because as we drag, we want it to stay on row 71. What's our fourth option? Our fourth option was comparing against a session specific target. So once again, what actually happened and what was supposed to happen. Once again, we've got to lock that just by row. And our final option, if they choose option number 5, we're referencing against game data. So again, we're choosing what actually happened and we're dividing it down by what they normally do in a game. So you might say that this was 75% of a match. Now if I close brackets up, that's it. We've got 5 options that are giving us the outputs that our user has come up with. So I'm going to pull that across, and if I drag it down, fingers crossed it's going to populate appropriately. And fingers crossed when I drag it across, it's also going to populate appropriately. I'm going to center it, even though ideally with numbers you don't want to center, I just think it looks better. I'll do some formatting in a second, but for now I'm just going to make them all number. Always a good idea. Now let's just do a bit of testing. Okay, if we're doing a basic extraction, which is what our option is, you can see that those numbers look alright. If we're doing a position reference, that's what it comes out like. If we're doing against the team reference, against a target, and against a game. So there you go, we've got those 5 variables and we could change them if we wanted to. Let's choose something else, player load, and things are updating dynamically and nicely. So that looks pretty good. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here and I am going to just create a little dynamic chart. Now I did create a space for it and I hid some columns to allow us to get through it. So I'm going to come down the bottom. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 variables that we have created. So I'm going to do a data validation drop down box that allows us to plot any one of those on a chart. Now you might do more than one of these, but let's just start with one. Right, so if we choose that, we've got some extraction going on. So again, I'm just going to do it in full view. Do the match function to see whereabouts in our table is our selected option. It is the 4th column or column D. And if I just quickly call this something, table session report, we can now do a pretty easy lookup. So that lookup would be something like this. You may or may not want to put the team, defender, midfield, striker average on the chart. It's up to you. I probably wouldn't at this stage, but you can think about that one yourself. VLOOKUP's really easy to use here, so I'm going to do that. What are we looking up? Well, we're looking up this athlete. Where are we looking them up? Well, we've got a table, we just created it. It's called table session report. What column is our answer in? Well, we just did a match function to find that out, and we always want an exact match. So I can either double click false, or if you've seen me before, just type a 0 and they do the same thing. And if I drag this down, we can see there's our number. Now this is what we want to chart because that allows us to be a bit dynamic. Now I'll finish up that label and combo piece in a second, but let's just get this chart plotted. Insert. You can choose your chart, but to me this is kind of a fairly good candidate for a column chart. Put it here so I can come a long way across. A little bit of chart tidying up. First thing that would be useful to do would be to link the title to our drop down box so that it updates with it. Second thing is to go into select data and get some data labels in there. So we could choose the full name, And unfortunately what happens is the names are too big and they go on an angle, and I tend not to think that that's a good idea. So might be able to just drag this box across. No, it doesn't like that. I'm going to have to click select data, and instead of full names, just put that in there. That's a little bit better, a little bit easier to use. I tend to like, I'll just undock this, have the gap width be at about 100, just a little bit better looking, and I'm going to add a data label. So now we've just sort of got a basic chart where you can pick whatever you like. And it's going to update for you. So at the moment we've got a little bit of a formatting problem in that these are percentages and they're not coming out percentages in the table. We could fix that a little bit, given that most of our reporting is referencing it against something else. We could simply go into format data labels. Down the bottom here under number, you can choose percentage. That's a fairly sort of sound option to start with, and it'll make the chart look a lot nicer straight off the bat. So a few things you could modify about that chart, but let's not get too caught up in that. Lightening the axis lines, possibly removing the vertical axis altogether is a good option. There's plenty of good ways that you could tidy that up. But I want to leave the tutorial there for now. The real key thing I wanted to demonstrate is that if you've got a data table that has been set up quite well, and you've got those good descriptors on the left, then creating a session report was probably your first port of call. Using date to extract out what information you want. If you just want to do a basic extraction, I would use a pivot table. If you want to have a look at that, let's give that a try. Insert pivot table to a new worksheet, and we can drag this across so we can put it on the screen a bit better. Date in the filter, player name in the rows, and let's just put a couple of variables in there. Sum of distance, max velocity, and zone 6 distance, for example. We can click out of this table, and as soon as we select, we were on the 7th before, I think, we've now got, without really having done anything, a session report that's perfectly good. And if we're on a PC, we could insert some pivot charts. I won't do that because then Mac users will have problem with this file. But one of the good things about pivot tables is you can set it up to automatically sort highest to lowest and things like that. But that pivot table option is perfectly good. But as soon as you want to start referencing against position team, benchmark, or game data, then pivot tables become a little bit less useful. They can still be a part of the process, but I tend to go for the formula option there. So all I did in this tutorial was create those different options here. I did it on the same sheet so that it was easy to connect what I was doing, but normally I'd put that on another sheet somewhere and reference it to the front page. The trick that was demonstrated in this video was that choose function. At the end you can use choose to then say, based upon an index number, extract out any of those particular options that the person has selected, position reference, team reference, whatever. So we've got a pretty nice dynamic report. The gold bars here indicate a selection option, so I'm going to put a gold one here too, and I'm going to take that away. And we've got a little dynamic chart at the bottom too. You're likely to want to make something a little bit more elaborate than that reporting wise, and we can have a look at some different reports such as longitudinal reports at a later date. Hopefully I can do a follow-up video to this shortly. Thanks for watching. Feel free to email me if you want to have a look at this file. Cheers.